Greetings, everybody. Welcome to the Readings from Oconomowoc event series. I'm Daniel Golden from Boswell, Lisa
And I'm
Bedoyan from
Lisa
Books and
Bedoyan
Company.
from Books and Company.
She is. And I'm just going to do a very short welcome. For Boswell, this is day 5,257 of us being in business. And some virtual series have gone away, but the Oconomowoc lives on. I give you Lisa Bedoyan.
Hi, everybody, and welcome. AJ Pearce grew up in Hampshire, England, and currently lives in the south of England. Her collection of over 800 vintage women's and news magazines is the inspiration for her series, The Emmy Lake Chronicles, which includes Dear Mrs. Bird, Yours Cheerfully, and Mrs. Porter Calling. Author Nina de Gramont, she's the author of The Christie Affair, says Mrs. Porter Calling is the rare novel that manages to be deep as it is delightful, funny, endearing, heartbreaking, and uplifting. It's a thoroughly entrancing story about friendship, work, and finding the best in life, even during the worst of times. And I completely agree. It is all of that. It was a delight to read. So welcome, AJ Pearce. We're thrilled to have you on Readings from Oconomowoc.
Oh, thank you so much for having me. It's lovely to be here. That quote was amazing. I was very chuffed to get that. So thank you. Thank you so much.
It really captures it. I mean, it's a nice nugget of what the story is.
It was very generous of Nina to say that. So it's always lovely when you're never sure what people are going to say when they send out all the arcs. So when someone says nice things, you're like, phew.
So we like to kind of start, even though I just kind of gave a flavor of the novel, but would you want to give a little elevator pitch if somebody were to meet you on the lift and let them know kind of what the story's about, and then maybe read a few pages?
Sure, of course. Mrs. Porter Calling is set in London in 1943, and it's the story of a young advice columnist, Emmy Lake, who is running a very successful advice column, helping the women of Britain to get through the war. She and her colleagues absolutely see their readers as family. They're incredibly important to them, and they're doing a really important job in keeping up morale and helping people with really very challenging problems. Everything's going great, and then a new owner arrives at the magazine, the Honourable Cressida Porter, who arrives, as I'll read a little bit in a minute, in a sort of a cloud of loveliness, telling everyone they're brilliant and she won't change a thing. I love everything. And then, of course, she then decides to start changing everything about the magazine, and is the very antithesis of what the magazine stands for. She's selfish, posh, and entitled. And the book is a story about a group of people coming together to try to save the magazine that they and the women of Britain love. So that would have to be me in an elevator in a very tall building, wouldn't it?
Sorry, or maybe it broke. I don't know.
It
or
broke.
I forget to hit the button.
Yeah, I pressed all the buttons, so we're now stuck. Right, you lumbered with me for hours now. So if it's okay with everyone, I'll just read the bit where Mrs. Porter arrives. It's written in the third person. So this is Emmy explaining how she meets her new boss, as it were. I headed off to the stairs, wondering if anyone had told Mrs. Porter that she would have to climb a couple of flights to reach us. From the stairs below came a high-pitched, rather breathy, almost musical voice. Really, Miss Poole, it was saying, I don't mind the climb one little bit. We can pretend we're in a castle. Lovely. Immaculately and clearly expensively dressed, Mrs. Porter was smiling, as if she was in the shadow of the Taj Mahal, rather than having clambered up a battered stairwell in need of a paint. Aged somewhere in her late 30s, Cressida Porter was picture perfect. Slim but not skinny, with dark brown hair and the sort of complexion that makes people talk about peaches and you instantly understand what they mean. She had a look of wonderment, as if someone had just given her the best Christmas present in the world, which, if you thought about it, Lord Overton had. Mrs. Porter almost danced towards me, offering her hand and beaming. Hello, she cried. How wonderful. I do love your blouse. Oh, I managed. Thank you. How do you do, Mrs. Porter? I said, which already seemed overly formal, as Mrs. Porter was holding my hand and smiling at me as if we were best friends. In stark contrast to my outfit, which had seen better days, she was wearing a beautifully tailored navy suit with 4 large buttons in the shape of flowers and a clutch of what looked like fabric hydrangeas by the lapel. A matching navy hat was simple but exquisite. The front tilted forward just enough to allow her to tip her head down and widen her eyes to gaze out prettily from underneath. "What a beautiful hat," I said, which would not have been my first choice of opening remark in terms of making a professional impression, but it was too late and anyway appeared to go down rather well. "How awfully kind," she replied. Then she leaned slightly forward. "Isn't it just the hugest relief that hats aren't on the ration?" "Absolutely," I said, although I was slightly drowned out by Mrs. Porter now laughing in a charming way. I was beginning to feel as if I was being run over by a steamroller made from petals and kittens. It was delightful, but also somewhat immobilizing. That's it.
Well, I'd love to start off talking about Emmy Lake. For folks who haven't read her or haven't read all of them, she is an indomitable spirit. One of the things I really loved about the first book was just how she just, despite the tragedies of wartime, the shortages, she just has, how people get through war when you really think about Emmy. And did she have, what were your origins in this character? I'd love for you to talk a little about that. How did you decide who she was going to be? Where did she come from? Because I know about the magazines, and we're going to talk more about the magazines. But
she sort of developed quite easily, actually. When I had thought of the idea that I wanted to write about women's magazines in World War II, I wanted someone young and enthusiastic to clash with the older, outdated agony aunt, Mrs. Bird. So I knew she would be young and enthusiastic, but it was really important that she had a reason to be very optimistic and also being brave enough to start sending out letters secretly in the name of an older agony aunt, which she does in the first book. I mean, it's an outrageous thing to do, really. She shouldn't do it at all. And I wanted to make sure she had a reason to be like that. I've been really lucky over the years to interview a lot of women who were young women and girls during the war over here. And it can be a cliche, the sort of keep calm and carry on and all that, but actually their spirit is incredible. And the memories that women have shared with me show such guts and bravery. And, even when really grim stuff happens, they do, keep their chins up and go, right, okay, we keep going. Because there wasn't a choice, you had to. And there is that incredible spirit, along with the aim of trying to find fun and nice stuff wherever you can. And I remember somebody once saying, well, why are you writing about dances and jollies during the war? That wouldn't have happened. And I said, well, actually, it absolutely happened. It was really important for morale and people to keep going. So I felt confident with all that. But Emmy herself, her parents are the big clue as to why she is as she is, because her dad is a doctor. He's in general practice, and so she's come from a sort of an upper middle class, very solid background. She's much loved by her parents, and she has that confidence that people have when they come from a very solid, privileged but not snooty background. And I put that together with her mum, who is far more bohemian and radical than her dad. Her mum was a very young suffragette. Her granny, who is mentioned now and then in the books, was a very active person in the women's suffrage movement. And so that gives Emmy her belief that women and everyone should be heard, that everyone should have a voice, everyone should get answers if they're worried. And that's why she really sticks up for other women, because she's just been brought up like that. And I've always been fascinated about that. If your mum was a suffragette, what were you like? If you were brought up like that, we forget that there must have been a whole generation of young women in the 20s and 30s and 40s whose mums, were chaining themselves to railings. That's radical stuff. So that's why Emmy has this kind of the confidence of being of her background, along with the belief that she must help people. And then she, with a good dose of optimism and cheer, and that's why she, particularly in the first book, goes head first into trying to help people. And what I've tried to do through the series, and certainly in Mrs. Porter Calling, she grows up during the war, and by the new book she's calmed down a bit, she's done her research, she's experienced, and she's a proper experienced advice columnist.
Yeah, she is a little calmer, but fortunately you throw a bunch of kids in the mix. One of the things to make things a little livelier, I'm going to pass to Lisa, but one of the things I've been thinking about in terms of her spirit was, it reminded me so much of, and I always get the generations confused, I think it would be Gen Z and their work, a lot of activist work with, say, climate activism, or in the United States, gun violence. And there was just an interview with David Hogg, I think, who is very active, and how they were attacked because they smiled in photos afterwards. And the people who were, the folks attacking them would say, well, this is a picture of, this is what you look like after you lose your fellow students to gun violence, ridiculing them. And it's sort of, and he said, at first they were upset, and they were like, our smiling, our happy, is our resistance. That's part of the resistance. And that's what it reminded me with Emmy.
Oh, thank you. Yes, it's I think in one of the books I said, every moment that they enjoy, every moment they're in love, or they do something positive, it's telling Hitler that he's wrong, and the way he does things, and the way he, the negative horror of everything he stands for. Even the littlest thing shows him he's wrong and reminds them what they're fighting for. So there's great meaning and depth behind the jollies, as it were, I hope.
Well, and you have to have something that feeds the soul to keep moving on in this hard work. And you can't just be in the muck 100% of the time, because it brings you down.
Absolutely.
And that in the story, just their support for each other and their friendship. But since Daniel brought up the kids, I loved the kids being part of the story, and how they offered that resiliency and the need to help them find joy, and to help them find the curiosity, and not let what other people's doings were going to bring them down to nothing.
Yes, so, thank you. Sorry.
No, just talk a bit about how you decided to bring them in, because you didn't have them in the first novels, correct?
That's right. Yeah. In the first novel, it's all about friendship. It's about Emmy and her best friend Bunty, and Emmy's other friends at the fire station where she volunteers, and at the magazine where she works. And then in the second book, in Yours Cheerfully, I started to explore relating to strangers. She meets a reader and gets involved with young women who are widowed in the war, and the issues that they have. And it was friends coming together, and the different people in her life becoming more and more important to her. And by Mrs. Porter Calling, it really is how the book's really about how friendship turns, if you're lucky, it becomes your chosen family. And I've been told that's why readers are it resonates with people, because it's very much what we do these days. We have, it's not the old-fashioned so-called traditional family setup. Friends and extended families and all sorts of families are more and more important. And in the war, actually that was happening, because many of the men were away, and people were thrown together through evacuation, or the housing shortage by 1943 in London was really significant, because many areas were bombed out. Service people from all over the world were coming into London, and it was really hard to find anywhere to live. So I also have in the current book the issues about people all coming to live together. And as part of that, 3 kids, George, Margaret and Stanley, they come to live with their mum, Thelma, who's a friend of Emmy's. And I like writing children. They're good fun, because they can say what the grown-up characters are perhaps thinking but wouldn't say. And particularly writing in the first person, where the whole of the voice of the novel is Emmy's. So it's really lovely to be able to bring in the children, and in their interactions with her and the other adults, we get their view. And I also wanted to have how children were coping in this really challenging time. And I'm also really lucky because my mum and dad grew up during the war in London, and they were evacuated out and all sorts of things. But I have, you know, on tap first-hand experiences of what it's like to be 9 years old, 10, 11, 12 at that time. And so I get the sort of, I'm forever emailing them saying, what did you know, what games did you play? What did you listen to? When did you first go to the cinema? And also the emotional stuff. I remember saying to my dad, you know, were you scared? And and they were scared on a level of, they were being bombed. Of course you were scared, but also, were you scared that Hitler would win? And I remember my father saying to me, well, we didn't think he would win because we believed what the grown-ups said. We believed the propaganda that if we all kept going, we would beat him. And that has to be the best advert for positive propaganda ever, I think, that a young lad who was only 9 when World War II broke out had that level of trust that no matter what happened, the grown-ups wouldn't let us lose. And I think that's a really powerful thing. So I have the kids in it, and they're there for an important reason, and also that means I get to do lots of fun stuff, like they go to the zoo and play around with all the animals, and all the kids are obsessed with pets and trying to get chickens and ducks and all this stuff, which is just a great way to have the lighter parts of a book set in the war. So yeah, I loved writing the kids.
The zoo part was great, with the competition of, you know, who knew about which animals were there and where they were going to go and when they came back. And then that also brought in that whole disruption for what war does too in our communities. Not just people. Yeah.
Yeah, it was that was fun researching the zoo stuff. And I had there's a bit in the book for anyone who hasn't read it about that the kids are quite competitive, you know, as children are, that kind of I know more than you know stuff. And there's a big thing about whether the aquarium is open. And my research had said that it was closed. So I was on a late draft with all about how they wouldn't go and see the aquarium. And then I was reading an old issue of Picture Post, which is a wartime news magazine. And in it said, and next week, the aquarium is reopening. And so I had this dash to kind of say, oh my goodness, oh crikey, have I got that wrong? So that's the problem with writing historical. So I added in a late thing saying, oh, we found a leaflet saying the aquarium is reopening. So like,
was it great
so
to
I got it right. Yeah.
It was a great way to just show time and how slow information traveled. So I thought you did it on purpose. So good job.
Yeah, so did I.
I did. Forget that. Can we edit this?
We'll edit that out afterwards.
Thank you. No, anyone watching, don't tell anyone, please.
Well, but of course, when you're writing, you know, as much as, you know, there's so much research in this book, and that's one of the wonderful things is you're really drawn into the time. But, you know, like many other authors, there are twists and turns that just happen, like that you can't plan. Do you have any, without giving too much away, do you have anything, like any development in the book that you just never expected to happen before you got to it?
The characters are quite lovely in that sometimes they write their own stuff. That's one of my favorite things I think about writing, and particularly
who's a character who turned out to be very different than you originally conceived of them?
Oh,
I'll come back to you in an hour. No, just kidding.
How long have we got? I think there's a character who's only in it a little bit. He's called Horace Batley Norris, who is he works at the ministry, and he's only in it for one chapter. But I absolutely fell in love with Horace, and I will definitely bring him back because I just loved him. And I won't spoil it for anyone who may have read the earlier books, but I got to bring back a character from the first book who was in it a little bit, and they could only be in it a little bit in Dear Mrs. Bird. And ever since then, I just knew I would bring them back. And so I've had them up my sleeve for about 5 years now. And so I've let them run free in this book. And I'm just absolutely delighted to do that. And Mrs. Porter herself became a monster, an uncontrollable monster that she's a runaway horse in this novel. She started off, she's a monster, and occasionally people will get in touch, and particularly early readers, my friends said, so you say she's awful and she's not that bad. And I've always said, what page are you on? Because she's a slow build. Well, not that slow. She arrives, and for a couple of chapters she's adorable, and then she's hideous baddie. So she became great fun.
There's premonition though, because you already, like, she's telling everybody what they want to hear, and you're like, problematic. One of the things that is just, she's just delightfully awful, isn't she? Was there any, when I was thinking about this in terms of magazines, and I know how much research you did on this, but it is actually not that hard to take an upscale magazine and send it, or television show, or anything, and send it, or store or anything, and send it downhill. It is very hard to upmarket anything. And was there any precedent for this happening in real life, or is this completely from your imagination? Did you ever come across somebody being able to do that?
Well, this is Mrs. Porter trying to turn the magazine in her delusional world, where she's the opposite to having imposter syndrome. I spend my whole life thinking I'm no good at this. What if people realize, and all that sort of stuff. But the delight of Mrs. Porter, of writing her, is that whenever she tries anything, she's amazing at it. She's the sort of person that has one go at painting and says, can you believe it? I'm really good at this. And so she turns up and says, I want to turn this magazine into a cross between Vogue and one of the Real Society magazines. And in actual fact, I certainly don't want to be unfair on Vogue, because Vogue, in it, although it's very upmarket and always has been, during the war it was doing its bit. Even the incredibly posh, rich, beautiful set, in those days, Vogue was full of how to do your bit, and slightly different to the women who were reading the weekly magazines, but everyone had to join in. So Mrs. Porter, there isn't really, I think, a precedent of someone taking a magazine from being mass market and then poshing it up, as it were. But the thing that I wanted to do with her, as well as having a decent chunky baddie, was I wanted someone who goes against everything we remember of our greatest generation. I wanted to write someone who didn't do their bit, who didn't carry on and do and give things up and become selfless and grit their teeth, put their chin up, and carry on for the good of the free world. Because we all know in our lives, in recent years, there are people who step up when times are hard, and there are people who just take advantage of it and still only think of themselves. So I really, although she's to start with, a fairly comedic character, and she does become pretty grim in it, I wanted to sort of explore the fact that some people were horrible, because some people are, and the black market was thriving here, people selling stuff off the ration. Crime did go up. Blackouts meant that it was easier to rob people. There was lots of nastiness still going on, and so I thought it would be interesting to bring in a character who is not doing their hearty bit at all, and is trying to profit from it and turn it only to her own well-being. So yeah, it's she's an odd one, Mrs. Porter. Yeah. She's ghastly, but I hope she reminds us. I said to someone the other day, these books have fun in them, I hope, and they are about spirited people, but this is not a World War II theme park. This is trying to set books in an era which was, obviously one of the the worst and most challenging times of our history. So she straddles a lot of that stuff.
Yeah, and I just kept waiting for her to leave and just go to America, where she seemed to be like positioning herself towards.
Yes, I think it's a really good point. I think I did at one point think she might have sent her children to America. Her children are never mentioned, because I decided that she's so selfish. The fact that she may or may not have children is rather irrelevant to her, but she's certain. That's my editor.
I my same thought. She had children beyond the dog.
She's so infantile herself. It's like, how could she possibly do this? But yeah, but
well, she's in my head. She has children because that would mean that she doesn't have to get war work, because by the time this book is it's based in 1943, when women of Cressida's age had to do war work unless they had children. And so I did think, well, she would have children so that legally she wouldn't have to have a war job. But they don't crop up because she sort of sends them away. And that is based on a letter I read in a 1942, I think, issue of a pony magazine, of a riding magazine, where they'd send in letters. The kids would send in letters with a photo of their pony or lovely stuff. And there was this heartbreaking letter I read ages ago where a letter was written sort of on behalf of this little person who wrote in saying, I really love your magazine and it's going to really cheer me up because I've got to be sent off to school and Mummy says she's going to let me have your magazine every month and it'll really cheer me up. And then at the end it says, you know, yours faithfully, Gerald, age 4. And some poor little tiddler was being sent off to school, never to be heard of again. And I just thought that's what Porter would do. She would have perhaps had a couple of kids because that's what you did. But, you know.
I've read a lot of books from the kid's perspective of that awful mother. So now it makes perfect sense to me.
What about for the dog's perspective?
Oh, small Winston. You do I just want to say you do such a great job of making that dog like you have the dog is something else, but also you at first, like, you have a sympathy for Winston that you do not have for Egg, I guess. But at first, I wasn't really sure you were going to. So,
well, I've wanted to get a dog into, and Cara, my editor, is very well aware of this. I love dogs, and I have a couple of them. And over here, whenever I'm asked to a meeting, I always have to check I can get a dog sitter in. So they're important to me. And generally speaking, I think that people who love dogs are good people. Mrs. Bird in the first book, the only thing really good about her is she loves dogs. But Cressida is just, you guys, anyone will think I'm a right weirdo, but Cressida doesn't respect dogs because she doesn't let small Winston have a proper life. You know, he has to sit on his cushion eating biscuits, which he puts up with, but he'd be happier playing in mud and eating disgusting things, as most dogs are. So I just enjoyed having this dog as a character who you don't know if he's a baddie, you don't know if he's a goodie. And this is, can I show you a picture of small Winston? This is a cigarette card from, and this is small Winston.
Oh.
And there's a bit in the book where small Winston gets his own double-page spread in the magazine wearing a variety of hats. And in one of the pictures, he's fallen asleep because he doesn't care about the hats. And this is the picture of him asleep in his hat. I have no imagination. It's all just copies, all from pictures.
So do you go to the stores and go through the bins of old family photos?
Yeah, I mean, junk shops. eBay is very good for any writers who might be watching. It's I do cast the books, as it were, from photos. I'll come up with the characters, and then I like to have, it's almost like having a talisman. I like to have something that either they either a photo of them or something that they owned. You know, I have shoes that belong to Emmy. I have a notebook that is hers. And sometimes photos, but not photos. I don't sort of say, oh, which film star would be great to play Charles. I like to find original pictures, photos from, I guess, their house clearances and all sorts of things of people who were 25 in 1943, because firstly, they have a real look about them. And secondly, it gives you kind of if they're the good characters, it gives you almost a feeling of responsibility, because this is an 80-year-old photo that somehow has ended up in a junk shop or a yard sale or on eBay. But for many years, someone has kept that photo. They've been in a family or they've been in a suitcase, and certainly someone at some point loved the person in that picture. And so for me, that gives an added sort of emotion to how I'm writing about them. Whereas I do have a photograph of Mrs. Porter, and in fact, it's in the book. She has a huge picture of herself put outside the front door of the office. And that is the photograph I
went to look for the actual picture. Was it a picture?
The picture is in the book, but sadly, probably for copyright reasons, it's not in there. But the photo I have is a studio shot of this beautiful young woman in a very late 20s, early 30s, hair bobbed and looking very gorgeous and quite rich. And she's sort of pouting, and she could look beautiful or she could look like a spoilt brat, depending on how you want to look at it. And when I saw that photo online, I thought, that's my Mrs. Porter. That's her.
Yeah, so, I love to just imagine the stories behind the photos, just like that. So
yeah, absolutely. Yes, I'm seeing the message.
Oh, that's just me buying the book.
Well done, please, yes, definitely buy it from these guys,
or wherever you want. But we're two fine options. That's all I'm saying.
Yes.
You do a wonderful job with you. Now I can see, from the way you're talking the photos, because I just feel like you bring your characters to such life. And you're doing it contrast. It's kind of I don't know if this is too American a reference, but it was like a Mary Tyler Moore show where you have like a vibrant home life and a vibrant work life, and the characters are kind of, they're not competing against each other. When I'm at the office, I'm like, I'm wondering what those people are doing in the house. I wonder what Del's doing. And when you're in the house, you're like, I wonder, has Guy confronted her yet? But did you have but they're great characters, and some are great and good, and some are great and bad. Mrs. Pye is sort of larger than life. I was trying to think of who she reminded me of, but she is in The Office, the American Office comedy, and probably the British one too, that sort of like just going, trying to get the best possible angle on things, how she's going to come out ahead. But then you were sort of like copy, well, maybe she really does, maybe she's really bought into it. What was your perspective?
Mrs. Pye. Mrs. Pye, I loved writing Mrs. Pye. Pamela Pye on Duty for Beauty. Here to help. She's the fashion and beauty editor, and she was just such fun to write, because she's, before Mrs. Porter turns up, Mrs. Pye's kind of like the fly in the ointment in the office. Everyone else is really good sorts and come on and and Mrs. Pye speaks in French part of the time, even though she's never actually left Britain ever, but she thinks that's sort of thing that fashiony people would do. And so she rubs everyone up the wrong way, and so she was in a good position for when Mrs. Porter came in. Mrs. Pye was there ready to perhaps have a different response to Mrs. Porter than the others. Mrs. Porter tries to take everyone in very much, and some people fall for it and some people don't. So having Mrs. Pye in there without putting in too many spoilers, was fun to have someone who saw Mrs. Porter quite differently to the rest of the team. But yeah, poor old Mrs. Pye. I was rotten to her.
Yeah, she just didn't. She did just rub the wrong way. Yeah.
Yeah, well, you know, she's. I mean, I really love writing about friends, and I love writing about people being hopeful and positive and stuff. But the books would be really boring if you didn't have people stirring it up, whether they're hugely malevolent influences or whether they're just kind of gritty. And Mrs. Pye is like the sort of person who wanders around. We used to have a teacher at school who would wander around with his pen and just sort of even in my day, you weren't allowed to actually stab children with pens, but you know, he would just do that. I mean, he probably would have. He was horrible. We hated him. But that's Mrs. Pye. She's the sort of person who would just, you know, annoy. So fun characters to write. Definitely.
We all know somebody like that.
And,
yeah.
You know, the greatest joy that you did is you don't really give her much of a team. Like usually it's a few, it's the mean girls, it's the, you know, but she's really kind of, you know, she just has her underboss who's just going around scowling at people.
Yes, there's Mr. Elliot, the second
Mr. Elliot,
yeah. He's kind of I really should say this. He's a bit like one of the politicians we have over here who is just horrendous. I won't name him. He's not worth
unnamed,
but an unnamed. But he's not entirely him. But when I was writing him, I went, "Oh, he's a bit like so and so." Double bad. So, yes.
Well, and I really appreciated the friendship with Mrs. Edwards and Guy, and how their past sort of shepherded the future. You know, shepherded us all into the future with the hope and the stability and the kindness. They just had this way where they were just right there without anything spoken.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, they're the link to the past.
Mm-hmm.
Monica is a character actually who surprised me. She was in the second book in Yours Cheerfully, and she has just grown and become more important. She's an important mentor for Emmy, and I've really enjoyed. I'm sure you know you'll see through the books there are lots of women of different ages mentoring each other and passing it on, kind of thing. And Monica, Mrs. Mahoney, Emmy's mother, they're all women who she learns from and she looks up to, and she in turn has young Hester, who's the assistant, who looks up to Emmy. So I love threading stuff like that through. That's important. But also Monica and Guy knew each other back in the 20s, and there's a link to the First World War, which is one of the most subtle threads, I think, in the books. It's that they've come from another war, and because there was only 20 years between the two wars, and I mean that's just so hideous. And as I get older, I must say, I think, my goodness, you'd have gone through the first one as a young person, and then which was the war to end all wars, and then 20 years later you're asked to do it all over again, only even more so because it was a total war. So Monica and Guy, I hope, bring a gentle reminder that people had already been through this. This was and so they have that kind of continuity.
I guess some people might say the First World War was the war to start all wars, not to the war to end all wars. So many conflicts kind of rise out of it that never really got sorted. What's it like writing? So we were talking a little about series, and what's it like writing? Like, what were you thinking of writing a series that's not like in traditional series genre? There's not really there. Lisa and I were trying to come up with a few models for this, but where do you go from here? How did you know what you were going to do with this? Did you just see the success? And how has it been like when, you know, people are like, oh, it's a series. Who died in this one? What's the mystery? How, you know, what's that been like for you? And what were you thinking of as your models?
Well, I think when I wrote Dear Mrs. Bird, as I was writing it, I just thought, gosh, I feel that given half a chance, I would love to follow these young people through the whole war, to see them growing up, to see them facing the challenges, and to take them all the way to the end. And I've always known how I want it to end, right from the start. But then the reality kicked in, and, you know, I was lucky enough to get an agent, and certainly when she was taking Dear Mrs. Bird, pitching it to publishers, what you don't do, as she very gently told me, is take a complete unknown like me and go, we've got a series of 4 books, and
35 books.
Yes, AJ feels she could write this all the way through. So we just got really lucky that, you know, when you know, firstly that Dear Mrs. Bird did well, but also when I was asked, you know, do you have a second book, which, you know, publishers do, if obviously you want to make sure somebody's got ideas after the first one. When I said, well, actually, I'd like to do some more of these, thankfully, my publishers said, yeah, we're up for that. So writing the series is, I had thought, I mean, parts of it are easy in that you already have your cast, your main cast, and parts of it are hard because you do have to develop them. And I think I'm getting the hang of it now, because you kind of say, right, I know I need a baddie, but they can't be the same as the previous ones. I know what I want to do, but it has to be different and fresh and interesting. But equally, I now know Emmy and Bunty and Guy and the others so well that they have become almost like part of the editorial team. So on Mrs. Porter Calling, I actually had been writing a completely different story, and I got to about 40,000 words in, and I just thought, this isn't working. This really, it was actually I feel sick even admitting it. It was ghastly because I was up against a deadline, but I knew it wasn't working. And it was the character Emmy that pretty much told me, because I thought, this isn't what she'd fight for. She would be very sympathetic, but this isn't what's getting her here. So that's when I had to kind of take a step back and go, right, well, and this is where I always start now, is, okay, what means the most to Emmy? What will she absolutely fight and fight and fight for? And I think that's probably at the center of all character-led novels, really. You know, what does your central character care to a point of pain about? Because if the central character doesn't care, you are not going to keep your readers interested. So that's where the series has gone, and the plan is to take the series to the end of the war, so everyone knows what happens if the characters make it through, if they don't, if they do, what, you know, where are they at the end of the war? And so that's the plan. And then who knows what would happen after that. They kind of live in my head. I see them, the characters they're all in a bus, in an old-fashioned bus in my head, and if I haven't been writing for them, I can see them hammering on the windows going, oi, give us something to do. So just because the series will end at some point won't mean that the characters will end, because they'll still be in here wanting adventures. So,
and there are those stories where they're great stories and you can love them to death, but the characters by the end, they're done. And then there's the other characters, you become so involved in their lives or their perspective, you carry them with you. It feels like they're a relative. And these felt like they were friends. I think about them often.
Oh, thank you.
And I think it's magic when a writer can do that. I think we had pieces of Blue, Holly Goldberg Sloan's book, and I think about those characters a lot too. There's just some that you kind of carry through.
It is interesting, isn't it? I remember reading Codename Verity, and just didn't sleep for days after I'd finished it. I was just lying awake going, no, just really kind of, I couldn't settle because I wanted to wade back into the book and sort things out, and I love that when you read a book and you either kind of, you're caught up with it and you're really, really thrilled for what's happening, or you're kind of like that, no, this cannot happen, you know. And sometimes, what did I read, oh my goodness, I'm going to get the I'm not going to say the title because I'll get it wrong, and I hate doing that, but I read a recent debut a few weeks ago and just loved one of the characters so much, and I messaged the author, who I don't know. I mean, I must have come over as a right stalker, going, I've loved your book, please can you tell me, will this character get his own book, or will he be okay? And she was lovely. She wrote back and she said, I don't know whether he'll get his own book, but I think he will be happy doing this. And I was like, thank you so much.
Oh.
So it's all right, I can rest easy, he's going to be okay. And so I love it when books do that. So I'm completely with you.
I have one question before we want to ask about some book recommendations and things, but I do have a question of writing a book, a setting and a history that's so familiar to English audiences, British audiences, but less so, especially in the details, for Americans. What was that something that there was any sort of conflict between the British and American publisher? I'm just going to give you one example, okay? So my favorite, which was her name,
picture.
My Egg and Cress. So I was like, I don't know what this is. I'm like, this is on my stand. I don't like egg salad. I don't like, but of course, when Pret a Manger opened, they were like, it was packed with egg salad. And then I went back 2 years later, it's like, I noticed not as much egg salad. And if watercress is so delicious, why don't Americans eat it? So this is
like, I know. What's wrong with you?
I don't know. I don't even know where to find it. Like, why is it on arugula or kale or romaine or something? So tell me about this thing that gives Cressida her name.
It grows wild here.
I think don't you guys call it sprouts?
No.
Those funny little long things.
Yeah, but they are sprouts. They don't look like that. That's a leaf.
Because I remember visiting family in Arizona years and years ago, and going to a sandwich shop and saying because they're wonderful big salad sandwiches, but I didn't want what we call cress, and I said, oh, no cress please, and so they served me a sandwich stuffed full of cress but with no crusts. Oh
no. So Lisa, you know plants. So what is cress? Sprouts?
Now, no, it's a little plant that grows low along wet areas. It grows along our streams there. It grows wild here. It's really peppery. Isn't it really peppery?
It is slightly, I'm sure. Has everyone tuned in to hear a big conversation about cress? Yeah, in fact,
that's why they're all here. I know.
Okay, cress fans, here's a fact. Fun fact, fun cress fact. I live near the watercress line, which is a train line where old steam trains used to go, and it's because it's all near the watercress beds, which, as you say, are all in water. And so, yes, that was a really good example of the difference between the UK and the US, because in Britain, anyone called Cressida, if someone said, yeah, their nickname is Egg, everyone would immediately know Egg and Cress. That's why it works. And so it isn't quite as obvious, perhaps. But no, I mean, and I'm not just saying this because my editor, I think, is on this on the chat.
Yes, she is.
Hello. For once, I'm not behind on a deadline, so I'm feeling really confident. But yeah, no, they're really, really good, and the copy editors, in particular, and the markups on the edits will sort of say, look, I've looked this bit up. Did that exist? And what do you mean by this? And they're brilliant, because almost everything in the book is exactly the same as the British version, and it's only very rarely we will change something if a word would absolutely baffle US readers or offend, you know, if there's some sort of odd thing.
Right.
there is one particular word which is always hugely hilarious to British people because it means something very different here to what you say, but I won't say it in case I've got it the wrong way around. But
No.
nowhere we don't. The other thing I love about my publisher's a Scribner, and we never try to make things easy. It's kind of, there's never kind of let's change everything, because that's, I think, patronizing to the readers. When we read American books here, we don't go, "Ooh, what's a sidewalk? The whole book's been spoilt. I don't understand."
It's so different. It's, as a person who's been reading a long time, the internet changed everything. Because pre-internet, a lot of stuff got changed in British books when they came to the United States. I remember I would read books and they changed the name of candy bars. They change all the spellings and things. You don't need to anymore. You just look it up. So in a way, it's become a lot more. It's great because now you can keep some continuity. You can keep some local flavor. You don't get, this is true about a lot of writers of different ethnicities who want, you don't have to translate all the words. You don't have to,
and you shouldn't.
And you shouldn't. We can do that.
And I would be sad if all those British idioms were gone and everything was gone. That would make it not a British book.
But you read a book, a lot of British books in the United States 30 years ago, they change a lot of stuff.
Well, I thought it was funny when you were talking about Miracle Whip and salad cream. And so then I wanted to think, like, okay, is salad cream like mayonnaise, or is it really the fake equivalent to Miracle Whip? And I hadn't looked that up.
Salad cream. Salad cream's a really 1970s relish, I think. I grew up on salad cream. We didn't really have mayonnaise in the 1970s. But salad creams it's more pourable and it's yellowier. And it's probably made of nuclear waste or something. I don't know, but we all grew up on it in the 70s.
So then different. It's different than even Miracle Whip, which is different than mayonnaise.
But Miracle Whip is also trademarked, so it can only be there. I think they call it something else when there's a knockoff version. Because when Miracle Whip was really popular, there was a private label version. They couldn't call it that. They might have called it salad something.
Yes. Well, I got that.
I know. One of us are fans.
If for anyone who hasn't read the book, there's a scene in it where Emmy and her friend Thelma are reading a couple of American magazines from that era, and I had got hold of a couple of American magazines I sent over to the States and bought a couple of 1940s magazines because I thought this was the sort of thing that Mrs. Porter would be aspiring to have, be very international. And it was really interesting because by 1943, the magazines over here are, 16 pages of very small print because we couldn't get hold of paper. And then in the post, these two amazing American magazines arrived, and they were big and thick and full of color pictures and stuff like Miracle Whip. And so I thought that would be a fun scene. It's a really small scene, but I also thought it might be a fun scene actually for American readers, that they're sitting there being kind of, wow, look at what's going on in America. And so, yes, it was a great excuse to get hold of some really lovely American magazines, actually. And
it really does sort of highlight the differences, because in that scene, I wrote it down because I love this. Colorful pictures and abundance on every page. And it was just that sense we still had abundance.
Yes. And I think it was, I know in the States that, the war effort was huge and there were shortages of stuff. But I was struck when I read the magazines that, my goodness, compared to the hundreds of I've got 800 or 900 magazines here, most of which are from the World War II era. And after spending the last 10 years reading them and getting used to them, it was a surprise when the American magazines arrived. I was like, wow, look at that. That's, look, you can buy a new bra, and you couldn't by 1943 in Britain. So yeah, really interesting cultural differences.
So someone's going to say, this book sounds very interesting, but after I read it, it turned out there was not as much about Miracle Whip as I expected.
It's one paragraph, folks. Just one paragraph. I can do a spin-off if you want.
Do you have any books that you'd like to recommend? I have to say, I just finished a book that's been a big success in the United States. That's also from Simon and Schuster, so I can probably get it. It was Secret Book of Flora Lee, which has some of the
Ooh.
same quoters. Did this come out in Great Britain too?
I don't know. I
You should
haven't
read it. I
seen
think you'd like it.
Yeah, I'm writing it down. I have recently finished Claire Pooley's The People on Platform 5, which I think has a different title, unhelpfully.
Yeah,
And she wrote The Authenticity Project, which I think was big in the US. And The People on Platform 5 is about a group of commuters on a train who are all brought together when one of them starts choking on a grape. And it actually is set on the train line I used to go into London for years when I was a commuter. And it's a very British thing that no one in Britain, it's virtually the law, speaks to anyone else on public transport. You just, unless somebody dies or somebody shouts, "Is there a doctor on board?" You never pretty much speak to strangers. It's and I can see why occasionally Americans might, because they're friendly, nice people, might say something, and British people are kind of, "Oh my goodness, a mad person has spoken to me." So I loved Claire Pooley taking that whole thing about the idiotic British way of staring out of the window and judging all the other commuters, and then they get to know each other, and of course they sort of learn to. Well, they become friends. That's not a spoiler. It's a lovely book. It's funny and hopeful and warm. I really, really recommend it. And I've just started Olivia Blake's Masters of Death. Very different, because I saw a tweet. I'm not on Twitter very much anymore, but I saw a tweet by Pam Macmillan saying that the hardcover was out, and the premise is it's about an estate agent who is a vampire, and the house they are selling is haunted and the ghost in it was murdered. And I just thought, now that's an elevator pitch. I want to read that. So, and I haven't read any. I know she's been very successful. I haven't read any Olivia Blake before, so I'm really enjoying getting into that. So those are my reads at the moment.
Oh, there's Olivia Blake. Yep, there she is. Masters of Death.
Trying to find if I can find.
And it's Iona, what is that? Iona Iverson's Rules for Commuting is the Claire Pooley. They changed the name here.
Yes.
People on Platform 5 works
Lovely
better.
book. Excuse me?
I said I like the title of People on Platform 5 better.
Yeah.
It's a bit punchier, isn't it? But I do like, it's like Eleanor Oliphant. That was a heck of a long title, and what a brilliant book.
Yeah.
Loved that. I really hope there'll be more from the author. Love that.
It's been a while now, so yes, so do we all. I don't know why people change titles anymore. It's once again internet. It gets very confusing. My customers will come in and they'll buy it. They imported it and then they want to buy it, and then they'll bring it back, and it's the same book.
Yes, that is a thing, isn't it? That you always have to be really careful. You don't want people. There's nothing more annoying than buying an exciting new book and then finding out it's just a different title of a book you've already read. Yeah.
Very sad for all of us. Well, I think we're at the end. Do you have a last question or word of convocation or anything?
I just recommend everybody pick it up and read it if they have not. And I didn't read all of them, so you can read this on its own. So don't feel like you can't.
We are to talk magazine-y and businessy, we are like a test market, because I read all three. Lisa only read the third one, and we both liked the book. So there you go.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. But may I just say, if anyone's interested in cheerful newsletters, I know there are millions of emails, but you can sign up for my newsletter at ajpearce.com, and I do a monthly newsletter which has book recommendations and cheerful stuff and news about what I'm doing and things I'm writing. So that's a plug for my for my newsletter.
And I think we're done, and so we're going to say goodbye. We actually rehearsed this, so we're all from Boswell, from Books and Company, from AJ Pearce. We're all going to say goodbye waving, and then I'm going to turn off the program. So thank you all for coming. We wouldn't have 2 bookstores, an author, a virtual event series, or anything else without you. So thanks.
Thank you, everyone, for listening. Thank you for having me. I'm waving.